Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka That. Exiled Hong Kongers will be pursued for life. According to Hong Kong's chief executive, we ask what lessons Taiwanese should be taking. With me to discuss this are Lai I-Chung, president of Taiwan think tank, the Prospect Foundation, Chen-shen, professor of political science at National Chengchi University, and Song Pu, political commentator, lawyer in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and Taiwan-Hong Kong Association president, who moved to Taiwan following the implementation of the national security law. President Lai, Professor Yan, and Song Pu, very warm welcome to the show today. Beijing has intensified its crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. Arrest warrants have been issued for 8 pro-democracy Hong Kongers who fled the territory to evade the national security law imposed by China. The law has been widely criticized as Beijing's tool for crushing any form of dissent in the territory. Rewards of 1 million Hong Kong dollars or 127,000 US dollars were promised for information leading to their arrest. The 8 stand accused of national security offences, including colluding with foreign forces and inciting secession. They include activists, former lawmakers and a lawyer. Hong Kong had this message for them.
So I want to tell the criminals that, well, the only way to end their destiny of being an abscondee who will be pursued for life is to surrender.
To me, it's not a surprise. I would rather treat this as maybe a badge of honor of fighting for the freedom and future of Hong Kong. So this is something that I am afraid of. But I hope that, well, many of us, 8 of us, could serve as a role model to keep on fighting. At least I will do so.
Song Pu, let me come to you first. So we heard John Lee say there that these people now, they are criminals. They will be pursued for life unless they surrender. Also, we know that funding these individuals is also against the national security law. How frightening must it be for them?
I would say for those 8 suspects, rather than saying they were frightened, they were saddened. I think their families cut off their linkage with them, and I think they do not feel they are frightened. They will keep on fighting to scale up their support and voices for Hong Kong, democracy and freedom, and also to keep their fight and guts to promote this kind of sovereignty or even independence of Hong Kong, or if not even democracy and freedom of Hong Kong. So in all, I would say they were not frightened. And the major repercussion of this kind of thing is that this is the beginning of a new wave of transnational regression and internal crackdown. That is to make sure the arrest warrant and bounty is just a kind of deterrence for those who have been exiled overseas. And secondly, also internal suppression of those comrades that were still in Hong Kong. Like recently, there were 4 people being arrested because they belonged to Demosisto, and they were allegedly funding those 8 people overseas. But after some sources have told me that's all a hoax, and none of them have received any monies from these 4 people. And then these 4 people also is just the beginning of an internal larger scale crackdown in Hong Kong. There were so many political parties previously in Hong Kong, and nowadays they were vulnerable of being cracked down. Some of them have been exiled to other countries, and their friends in Hong Kong would be blended a charge and so as to crack down on them. That's number 1. Number 2, and number 3 is that to cut off the connections, the interpersonal relationship, the trust, and also any money flow between Hong Kong and non-Hong Kong factions. Take, for example, if one of the parents of one student who are now in exile in Taiwan from Hong Kong fund their tuition fee, his father or his mother or her father or her mother would be vulnerable of being arrested and vulnerable for punishment up to life imprisonment. So it's very scary. So
whilst these people are incredibly brave, and we obviously support them and yourself in Taiwan, it is incredibly frightening. They are based in countries, I understand, Canada, Australia, the US, the UK, that don't have extradition treaties, Professor Yen, with China. But does that mean that the CCP, cannot reach in and get them?
I think even if you do have the treaty, I don't think Washington, London, or Ottawa or Canberra will make that kind of concession and turn them out. You just think about this. Death penalty in the U.S. Makes some people escape to Canada, and Canada will not return those people to the U.S. if they know when they return them to the U.S. it will be capital punishment. So Canada, you can flee. A U.S. criminal can flee to Canada. I'm just giving you the case that even democratic country, if they find your law is really very much against my value, I'm not going to consent. So the same thing here. I don't think these 4 countries would do that. Most of the time when you find Hong Kong dissidents, when they left the country, these are the destination and these are the safe haven for them. I don't think China can touch them at all. The only one China can touch, just like Sampu mentioned, will be their relative parents who might support them. But this is the very ironic part, because if they are in exile in European, American countries, US, what the Chinese always accuse is you are being financed by CIA, by foreign government, right? But now, if you said they are financed by their parents, then their parents are going to be punished. Then are you trying to push them to get support from foreign sources? That's a strange idea, for me, because China, if you want to accuse them being financed by foreign government, then their parents' support is not going to make a problem. You want them to have their parents' support, right? But if their parents support them, you bring them to prison, you accuse them of crime or complicit in this one, then it would be a problem.
But how about, there was the news about the Hong Kong bookseller in Thailand. He was kidnapped from his own home in Thailand.
Yeah, Thailand. That's okay. That's the difference here. I think if it's Southeast Asian country, maybe you're not going to be very safe. But if it's a Western country, especially US, UK.
So you're saying there was collusion by the Thai authorities?
I think not formal government. Maybe some of the security people, Chinese were able to bribe them.
But that's a reason why China has set up these illegal overseas police stations. So how about local Chinese tip off the local illegal police stations? They coordinate a strike on somebody at their home.
Yes, that's perfectly the possibility. I would say the possibility is lower than in Thailand, that's for sure. But when you take a look in the Taiwan history, when Professor Peng Ming-min has been exiled to Sweden and later to the US, they were continuously being focused by some security police overseas, and maybe some gangsters overseas. Take for example, if one of these 8 people can be kidnapped into a carrier, a vessel, then to ship back to Hong Kong, and then that vessel company or the owner can earn that 1 million bounty, right? So I think I cannot rule out any possibility, but because many of them, these 8 people are comrades of myself, and I know them very well from the very first day when I left Hong Kong, and they have no way back, and they will still be pushing forward their agenda, and they will be fearless in doing so. And this will mean sacrifice. That means families, friends, relatives in Hong Kong, if any, can be vulnerable for persecution. And I think this of course not good at all. But I think for the good of Hong Kong, we must pay the price to make the sacrifice for a new future in the long run.
President Lai, that is a huge sacrifice that these Hong Kongers are paying for perhaps for future generations. Can Hong Kong democracy survive, or do you think it's doomed to fail?
Hong Kong democracy is right now under severe attack from the authority, and it will be very difficult for them to sustain at current stages. So that all we can think of is that the hope of the democracy itself will not die. And the so-called the 1 million Hong Kong dollars bounty on those 8 people, basically it's the Hong Kong government their wishes to really camp down to tip up the hope for democracy. But I think that the bounty itself could have some serious effect later on. For example, some people just talk about the bounty awarded probably by some others, but there are bounty hunters, whether that is in the United States or other places.
And they are illegal.
And they are legal, yes. So that the attempt to really grab them and then send them back to Hong Kong, that threat is real. And we witnessed several of them. And also, we just cannot assume that because they are in the US, UK, and Australia, those governments will not submit themselves to Chinese pressure so that they are safe. It is not like that. First of all,
you're saying that we can't guarantee that they.
We cannot guarantee, because we do know that there are the example in the past that I remember back to the days in South Korea, there in the dark days, Kim Dae-jung, who was in Japan in 1970, early 1970, and he was kidnapped by the South Korea intelligence services from Japan all the way to Korea, and almost just dumped to the water in order to kill Kim Dae-jung. But fortunately, there are some interventions so that Kim Dae-jung has been was able to survive and then later on become the president. And the issue about the life and the threats that they received, not just about the bounty, but also other factors, that's real. Another thing is that they also were limited, those 8 people's, their traveling freedoms. Yes, in their country, probably they are relatively safe for now, but should they go to other places, not just about Thailand, but for example, go to Spain or go to Hungary. Spain, Hungary, both of them, they are European Union countries. And there definitely will be conferences or the meetings there for issue of democracy. And then those people probably they need to be there in order to broadcast the Hong Kong's cases. But in those countries, I would not think that they will be in much safer hand because the Spain government, I do remember back then, although very different cases, but they cooperate with China in terms of the return of the Taiwan's, the so-called fraud cases.
Right.
Yeah, from Spain to China, and without listening to any of our pleas. So I will say that the threat is not trivial, and so for them to continue the struggles, they will have more difficulties. And probably this is just the beginning of the serious the threat to other Hong Kong democratic activists, and starting from those 8 people.
Okay, now Song-Pu, President Lai mentioned Western countries. Australian PM Anthony Albanese says it's just unacceptable and that Australia will disagree with China where we must. Now, let's take us back to what is at the root of this. If you can give us a brief run through of the roots of this, where we are now.
At this moment, there are two people, Ted Hui and also Kevin Yam, being wanted and issued bounty for $1 million Hong Kong dollars against Australia. So Australia needs to stand up for its Australian citizen, Kevin Yam, for example, to make sure that they will protect them and to fight against the encroachment of Hong Kong government and actually the CCP regime against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Australia, because they are stirring up troubles, inducing people in Australia to catch them and receive the bounty in Hong Kong. Yeah. And I would say this is a Hong Kong version of the spy balloon incident in the US, and this will apply to Australia, the UK, and the US. The essence of spy balloon incidents is the infringement of sovereignty and territorial integrity of one country. And I would say that Australia has stood hard against them. And I would encourage, like their foreign minister, Penny Wong, standing hard against it and to make sure that to protect, and also a kind of recommendation for Taiwan government also to make a proclamation that we will protect those who are in exile to Taiwan and who have been fighting hard for Hong Kong freedom and democracy.
Yeah, very, very good point, Sang-Pu. We hope that they will make that declaration. Tell us how the national security law came about.
The Hong Kong national security law was down to Hong Kong by a passage of the National People's Congress back in June 2020, and it was enacted ever since 11 p.m. of June 30th of 2020, and it was a product of the 2019 anti-extradition bill movement. Okay, and because the CCP regime lost every trust and hope for Hong Kong people to really believe in CCP again, because you see a lot of elections in the district councils, more than 85% of those seats were occupied by pro-democracy activists. So you will see that CCP has lost trust in Hong Kong. They want to crack down on Hong Kong. And the international world has been scaling up the support for Hong Kong. The CCP is afraid of Hong Kong's secession away from China, and also to provoke any internal troubles within mainland China for subversion of their state power, and also to afraid of any power struggle within the CCP, and also international containment. They would like to make sure that the Hong Kong problem will be dissolved. So they want this NSL on, and not just NSL. They would like to restart the engine of some old laws which are against human rights abuses, like sedition laws. Okay, and they would like these sedition laws to be enacted, to be reignited for enforcement. And also there will be another Article 23 paradigm that they would like to make sure that any kind of spying activities, and spy could be defined very broadly, and also in an uncertain manner, to make sure everything is caught. You will see that this NSL has an extraterritorial effect for Taiwan, for the US, for any country, that any people at any places has spoken against Taiwan, Hong Kong related national security would be vulnerable for punishment up to life imprisonment. So I think this is very crucial.
Let me bring in Professor Yan. Hong Kongers have adopted the term white terror. Now this is seems to be apt in terms of what Sang-Pu has described to us. Now the white terror term is actually taken from Taiwan's white terror period, where there were mass killings by the KMT. So do you believe this term is apt?
Well, first of all, when Hong Kong was returned to mainland China back in 1997, I think the big problem for China is they recognize that Great Britain, during the colonial rule, that Hong Kong was very much a free society, even though politically it was not. Okay, you don't have the political rights of voting for the leaders. There's not this kind of election like we have some of this right now. But I think China would never figure out this. Like they feel that as long as you have election, that you should be happy.
President Lai, do you agree with that?
I think I would use the term not white terror but red terror. So the white terror basically was the description for the anti-communist but the authoritarian regime terrorizes on people. So that's the only differences I just like to have. But I think I agree mostly with both Professor Yan and Sang-Pu for the description about the terror tactic that the Hong Kong administration right now they wanted to have on the Hong Kong people. But I also like to say that the tactic of have the bounty about 1 million Hong Kong dollars for those 8 people, and probably later on they will be add more. And just right after that, their arrest, just like Sang-Pu said, about the 4 other activists on the alleged about their supporting financially to those 8 people overseas. I think the similar things or similar charges against other people will also emerge. But the issue about those $1 million bounty also has the effect that that is for anyone or any other organizations get in contact with those people supported their activities. Right now, China probably will have other legal means to act against them, because just on July the 1st, we do know that China enacted both anti-espionage law as well as the so-called law on PRC's foreign relations. In those laws, which in our view is not really a kind of the legal document, but expression of political will and a political attitude, they did try to penalize or try to maximize Chinese authority in criminalize the activities that they think will in contradiction to Chinese national sovereignties. So that's why I think the foreign ministry spokesperson Mao Ning talked about the infringement of the China sovereignty and the foreign interference. That is the reason for those. So that with the enactment of those laws, what it did have the effect is about any foreign nationals, whether you are in Chinese soil or overseas, should you support the action, for example, like with those 8 people, then whether your business in China or yourself when you travel to China, you could be locked in jail. That's exactly what those laws threaten to have. That's why both the United States and Canada had already labeled China at the next highest level of the travel alert.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Professor Yan, very last question, in just a few sentences. So it's not news that Taiwanese have rejected, increasingly rejected unification or identifying as being Chinese. What do you think the impact will be going forward of this new development? As Sang-Pu called it, is a new wave of suppression, of oppression.
Well, to me, I think Taiwan, we need to show that our determination and our will by really having solidarity with Hong Kong dissidents. But a lot of times there will be some, But
in terms of whether we want to unify, because there is a proportion of the population and political parties who do think about this as being one China.
But this is what I'm trying to say is, if we have shown solidarity, supporting Hong Kong people, in Taiwan, then people, even in Beijing or in the Western world say, yeah, Taiwan is really standing up for democracy and human rights in Hong Kong. But then we found out, we have the same kind of draconian law to admit Hong Kong people into Taiwan. And then people say, you are not really in solidarity. You just say that, but you can actually do a lot of things, but you never do. So I would say
that's a different issue to what I'm trying to get you to answer.
But I would say action.
Respect.
But I would say action will show. Otherwise, even if you claim
those actions are to do with solidarity with Hong Kong. What I'm trying to ask you is the political parties in Taiwan who eventually want to unify with Taiwan, with China, when it comes to a good time, will they be taking on board this latest development, the bounties?
Of course, even if like Professor Zhao Chen-shen recently mentioned about Taiwan should have a unification law. I don't have any problem with that. But this is what I'm saying. We have to tell Beijing what we want. We cannot just say, we don't want what you offer. We have to say what we want. So for example, if we have, if Hong Kong, lost its human rights and civil liberty, don't mention about unification, in Taiwan, because we want to have the kind of civil liberties and political rights, and until you have those, we will not unify. But I'm always flexible in that way, saying I can be unified, but these are my conditions. Or you can never meet the condition, then don't mention about it.
Now, we're joined by Edward Wittenstein, who is visiting Taiwan from the US. He's from Yale Jackson School of Global Affairs, where he's the Executive Director of International Security Studies and a lecturer on global affairs. Edward, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Former Commerce Minister and influential trade advisor Wei Jianguo says there is more to come following Chinese export restrictions placed on metals used in chips, EVs and military equipment. Wei described the curbs as a well thought out heavy punch and just a start, threatening escalation if restrictions targeting China's high-tech sector continue. China abruptly announced controls starting August 1st on exports of some gallium and germanium products. This sent companies scrambling to secure supplies, as China controls 60% of the germanium market and 80% of the world's gallium. A day after the announcement, Xi Jinping told the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that China wanted to work with other countries to, quote, reject the moves of setting up barriers, decoupling and severing supply chains. Edward, if I could come to you first. How should we read these restrictions? Are they protecting national security, as China says?
Well, China, of course, reserves the right to take an action that it might deem in its interests, although in this case, like many of recent Chinese actions, threatens very much to backfire, and the justification is unclear. That I have about this is that it's such an overbroad action that it might very well threaten to disrupt the global supply chain, disrupt the economy, threaten the domestic recovery, economic recovery in China from COVID. In addition, the justification does not really align with the import-export controls that the United States has taken with respect to high-tech chips. The issue that the United States and its allies are so concerned about is that, in particular, this type of high-end, high computing chip may very well and has been used to aid the domestic surveillance and security apparatus of China, as well as its military advancement. And there's been insufficient transparency to guarantee that the export of these chips would not have that effect. So in this case, these rare earth minerals are a much broader type of restriction, not without that justification. So it's concerning to me. And if China were sufficiently transparent on how the end use of some of these technologies might result, there could be room for discussion with the United States and the world.
So you say that despite there being some military uses for, say, gallium and germanium, it's still not targeted enough like the US
Correct.
Controls, right?
Yeah, the US controls are narrowly targeted. They're focused on particular types of very sensitive equipment or particular companies that have shown that they're misusing that equipment.
President Lai, so is this simply retaliation?
I believe so, because China look at the United States, the sanction against the China. China look at it as this is part of the China-U.S. competition, or basically the U.S.-China, whether that technology war is economic war. And China believed that they need to take some action against it. And earlier, China started to copy what they believe that is the U.S. actions. So they first came out with the unreliable entity list, just like the United States, they put up the entity list, and later on with other similar actions. Now the China believed that they had the advantage in those rare earth mineral, the critical elements for producing the high-end chips, and the China, since control the majority of them, they believe that they could do it and hit the West very hard in order to extract or force the U.S. to back down. So that's basically what the Chinese are thinking about.
Professor Yan, so is it surprising that China hasn't retaliated, in this at this sort of scale earlier?
Oh, of course, I think China has a lot of instruments at hand they want to use, but they always try to find, the proper time to use it. But I always think that China felt that, it does control a lot of production of, of all this, rare earth. But there is possibility other countries can do the same thing. U.S. can also produce rare earth, but it takes time. And then this is my major point. It's polluting. And a lot of times, when you try to unearth all these rare earth metals, it takes a lot of time, it's pollution, and maybe there's some labor condition working there. And then I think China is pointing out, maybe saying, you accuse, Xinjiang and other places, all this, but here, you should also say, hey, this is like blood diamond, this is blood metals, you should never use. So I'm helping you by not exporting, restricting to you. So in a way, China is playing this game because I think there is a problem with Western world when we talk about human rights and all that.
But Professor, I think what the
High-tech.
Chinese are saying is that it's to protect national security.
Well, of course, but China knows that the other country can produce them the same way, but it just takes time. It's also pollution.
Edward, how likely, okay, so why don't we address the point that Professor Yen has made, which is he's saying that there's hypocrisy here. So let's just focus that in terms of the US-China tech war. Do you believe there's any hypocrisy in terms of what the US does?
Well, it is not hypocritical to be concerned about exporting a technology that you may also wish to use. And it's not hypocritical when the use of the technology has a very different value system or political system attached to it. So yes, both countries seek to utilize this technology for their economic benefit, but there also are potential dual-use military or surveillance applications of those tools. So the risk becomes, in the Chinese context, that without sufficient transparency or in centralization of their system, that this technology might be used for that dual-use end. So the United States is not willing to be a party to that. The United States is not trying to change the Chinese system or stifle the economic advantages of the technology. So again, I think with sufficient transparency, these tools could be used perhaps in China in a way that would not have subject to this restriction.
So what's the next step now? I mean, obviously the companies, as we said, they're scrambling to get other suppliers. What's the knock-on effect of this? How quickly can they get other suppliers? Has China got enough of a monopoly?
Well, they do have a sufficient monopoly, and it will be a period of time to recover. Again, one of the negatives of an action like this, why China's actions sometimes create a deleterious effect in China, is that in this case, by having the restriction, you are encouraging the United States and partners around the world to develop an alternative supply chain for this critical type of mineral. So what likely will happen is that over time, the United States will have an ability to insulate itself from this effect. So this is sort of a one-time use tool, and it may very well stimulate the type of US and other industry on rare earths to create an alternative supply chain. So I do think the United States and its allied countries and partners have an ability to insulate itself from this shock over time.
President Lai, so diversifying away from China, but China can also diversify itself, can't it, away from the West? So it would work. It could work both ways.
Well, diversification, that's the tactic that people will use facing the threat or the sanction or tension that targeting against themselves. But the issue is that it's easier said than done. About the Chinese weaponized rare earth supply, I remember back in the year 2010-12, Japan also experienced similar action by China, but then Japan in the next, right after the target sanction by China, in the next 2 or 3 years, put a lot of effort in diversifying the supply. And later on, in year 2015 and 16, when China wanted to or threatened to have the similar action against Japan, and found out that Japan already diversifying itself good enough that the Chinese just cannot have the intended effect on Japan. But we are talking about right now, China is across the board. So it's not just about a single country, because one single country, the need could, the diversification and the effort to meet the target will be much less. But this is the whole system. So the issue is that although we want to diversify, but then what will be the cost and the cost that we want to bear in order to have the diversification? That is the key point. So that's the supply, especially the pollution associated with the producing of the rare earths. Many actually they are not rare, but there are plenty, but only in the process that the pollution a lot of people just cannot stand with. So that the issue is still how much cost we are willing to pay for this. That is a problem.
I mean, I know that rare earth mining, China is responsible for 60%. So there are other countries that make up the 40%, 85% of processing. So maybe these are pollution-freer side of it, and 92% of magnet production. Professor Yan, just last question, and as brief as you can. I wanted to pick up on what Edward had said there about how, in effect, this move could bring about the very thing that China does not want. China does not, as we heard, Xi Jinping said, he does not want decoupling. He does not want the cutting off of supply chains. But as we've discussed,
I think
this could be accelerating it.
I'm not saying, I don't think this is going to be decoupling, but this is what exactly Yellen mentioned about de-risking. This is a risk for both China and for the international community. So I'm not sure why China did this, but I think China might have enough of this double talk on human rights or pollution, this type of things. If you really care about environment, we are sacrificing here in China to unearth these metals, and then you use them, and then you continue to criticize the human rights. I think that's Beijing's motivation.
So you do think that's a key point? Okay, right. In June, more than 11 million young people in China graduated from university. The problem is many of them have no jobs to enter as China's youth unemployment rate rises above 20% and the post-COVID economy stagnates. Traditional pictures of students throwing their hats and gowns in the air have been replaced by photos of them lying on the ground, sometimes face down. It's been identified as part of a social phenomenon known in China as tangping, or lying flat, or its darker spin-off, bailan, or let it rot, describing general demotivation. Professor Yan, let me come to you first. Tell our audience how bailan developed from tangping and how it's different.
Well, tangping is like, I don't really want to work hard. I'm just going to work maybe 2 or 3 days a week, or 3 months, or in a period of time, and then I'm going to stop and take easy. So that's tangping. Just don't do anything extra. But bailan is a little bit further. Bailan is basically, I'm not going to do anything, and basically let the society decide, let my parents decide how they're going to deal with me. Because the outside world, which I enter after being insulated in the academic world, is totally different. I suddenly felt I cannot adjust my life there. So and if there's no proper job for me, then I'm just going to be a couch potato. I'm not going to work.
Do you think this is a protest by these students? Is it meant to be a message to the government?
I think both. Here, China's economy, you have to remember in the past 30 years, it's always 7-8%, and even earlier was double digit, and now it's down to 5%. So there is a limit of economic growth, and then the job creation is limited. And this is the last patch of the Chinese population that is still growing, and then after that we have fewer young people. So this will be the one that if they stay on the job long enough, I think it will be okay. But I think the attitude is something you cannot change.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like when after the COVID, when some of the young people in the U.S. are being paid.
Yes,
right?
actually, I wanted to bring Edward.
And then you ask them to return. It was very difficult. Sure. So
yeah, and maybe that did bring on the phenomenon in the U.S. social phenomenon of, let me get this right, quiet quitting. Do you think that this? I mean, are there differences with let's say bailan?
Bailan,
yeah, bailan, which is like the sort of darker, the derivation of tangping.
Well, I'm not familiar with the details of the phenomenon, so I appreciate the professor explaining that. I do understand and appreciate the stresses on young people, particularly those in China, who are facing acute economic and social distress. So the COVID lockdown, the stall of the economy, the forced working from home or learning from home on virtual Zoom or other technologies has a very atomizing and lonely effect, and it does not replace the social interaction in which young people need to thrive. So I can see that coupled with the centralization politically in China has created more and more limited opportunities for young people.
But how does that compare with the situation in the US with the quiet quitters?
Well, look, the COVID lockdowns in the US as well and around the world have put pressure on young people to try to find new methods of economic and social activity. I do think that the way that in the United States we have opened up, we've resumed in-person learning on the Yale campus where I teach. It's a thriving social educational world, and there are greater long-term opportunities, based on merit performance. So to the extent that you are concerned about that being a possibility in your system, I think that does create mental health and distress. But look, young people around the world are connected. They have a lot in common. And the Chinese students that I interact with, both in China as well as at Yale and in the United States, are extraordinary. They're inspiring. They yearn for a better future for themselves and their families.
Do many of them look for work in the US afterwards? Obviously, the youth unemployment rate in the US is more than 9%, so it's half of the 20%.
Chinese students are looking to study everywhere in the world, and they are welcome in the United States and a key part of the US and the global economy. Another factor, of course, is that US or Western businesses are becoming increasingly worried about doing business in China. So that portion of the job market in China is also starting to decline. And that's part of the de-risking phenomenon that we were just talking about. It's a greater risk now for US and Western businesses to be interacting in China and being subject to this volatile domestic regulatory market. So this has a cascading effect on young people.
Yes, President Lai, the feeling of demotivation, maybe hopelessness, I don't know whether we go as far as despair, how significant a problem do you think that is, or that it could become in China, given they've got the demographic issue of an aging population and an economy that doesn't seem to be lifting post-COVID? Do you think this could become a problem for the next decades?
It definitely will be a huge problem. First of all, the Tangping and then the Bailan, the phenomenon itself, not just about the lack of the economic or job opportunity for the younger generation, but also the feel hopeless in terms of controlling their future. So that I think it is especially the latter parts that led to the exactly the kind of attitude that I'm just laying there. I'm not going to work on anything because I already lost hope, or even try to work, I will be discouraged to say something that will affect my own future, especially after the COVID and the zero COVID policy that really killed all the social momentum in China. Although the white paper movement itself sort of raised some hopes, but I think the recent development and the emphasis about the total control by Xi Jinping killed that hope again. And another thing about it is that when we talk about the Chinese, the lost job opportunity, but we have to remember, we have to know that last year China already entered the real depopulations. So the people die. They call 生不如死. That is the people burst. More people died than the people got burst. And but at that time, the kind of the social phenomenon basically will bring more jobs to the younger people because the vacancy will have more. But the phenomenon is actually on the contrary. So that means that they lost more jobs. So, and some of them, just as Professor Ed just said, that it's because of the foreign investment, and no longer they want to de-risk about their footprint in China. But another thing is that how much of the social control by Xi Jinping killed the private enterprise within China, which is a mainstay for the Chinese job market. Now the last thing is that the whole when we look at the situation, similar situation like in Japan, in last several years, it's actually their job rate is getting higher. precisely due to the depopulation issues. So the youngster, they have more jobs opportunity. But in China, that actually speaks to the severity of the issues.
I see. Now, can I also ask you about 2049? Now, this is an important year, because it is the goal of Xi Jinping to make what he calls a moderately prosperous society by 2049.
That is not going to happen, because just look at demographic right now. That all the estimates indicate that by year 2050, probably China will have people who are over 65 will have the population over 40%. Just look at that. The 40% of population will be fed by probably just under the 1/3 of the populations, and every single youngsters, they will bear the responsibility for the welfare, probably more than 1 or 2 people.
Exactly, yeah. So that's the economic environment. Edward, if I could bring you back in. So, part of that 2049 goal, the national rejuvenation, as we all know, is to take Taiwan. So, when we look at the young generation now, and we recognize that it's a problem, they don't have hope, they're despairing, they don't want to struggle. Are these the kind of people that you think would be prepared and ready to go to war with the United States, possibly?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think willingness to fight is, of course, one key element of a military. If you look at the Russian situation in Ukraine, we've seen a lot of issues with morale, and I think part of that is about the question of who am I fighting for and what am I fighting for, and is it worth it? So no doubt that is connected to your question. Having said that, the capabilities in China's military modernization plans have worried the United States and the world. But a conflict over Taiwan would be disastrous to both China and the United States, and of course the people of Taiwan. And so it's hard for me to see how a real kinetic conflict in Taiwan would help achieve the broader goals and economic goals of the China dream, because the economic impact of any conflict here in Taiwan, I think, would really damage the broader economic goals. So
and then if you wipe out the young people through war, then...
Sure, that's right. And the One China policy of the United States is designed to buy time, to push off as long as possible the possibility of any unlawful move to alter the status quo, and hopefully cooler heads will prevail across the strait in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to have to end it there. President Lai, Professor Yan, and Edward, thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Hello, I'm Ian Kavat of Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section. Take care and see you next time.